It didn't start with gunfire. It didn't start with explosions or screaming headlines. It started with something much quieter, something more dangerous, a silence too perfect, a calm too deliberate. In the capital city of Ouagadougou, beneath the still hum of night, President Ibrahim Traoré stood by the high windows of the Kosham Palace, staring out into the darkness. The city slept, unaware. The lights of the ministries flickered, the guards stood in their posts, and somewhere deep in the alleys and corridors of power, betrayal moved like smoke. That night, the air carried a strange weight, a feeling Ibrahim couldn't name but couldn't ignore. It was the kind of stillness a soldier learns to fear, the kind that precedes an ambush, the kind that speaks of danger not in noise, but in absence. For weeks, subtle cracks had begun to form, invisible to most, but obvious to him. Operations that had been planned in absolute secrecy had been met with resistance. Enemy fighters had shown up in villages they shouldn't have known existed. Convoys were intercepted in areas that weren't on any map, except his. Conversations whispered in confidence began to echo back through the enemy's movements like mirror reflections. They were being outplayed not by luck, but by knowledge. Someone had information. Precise, intimate, dangerous information. It wasn't just sabotage, it was strategy. The kind of strategy that could only come from inside the palace walls. The realization settled in Ibrahim's chest like lead. It wasn't a foreign army that threatened the nation from afar. It was a traitor sitting somewhere too close, too trusted, too familiar. He tried to think back. When did it start? Was it when foreign soldiers were sent home and the power balance shifted? Or when the country's wealth was reclaimed, the gold and the contracts brought back under local control? Perhaps it began when foreign advisors, who once moved like kings, were shown the door. What he knew for certain was this: Burkina Faso had dared to say no. No to the old masters, no to the silent invasions, no to being a pawn. And now someone wanted to reset the board, but they weren't coming in through the gates. They were already inside the meetings, inside the conversations, inside the circle of trust. It wasn't the enemies outside that kept Ibrahim awake. It was the silence inside, the kind that held secrets and waited to strike. He remembered a saying his father once told him as a child: "The sharpest blade is the one you never see until it's already inside you." That night, those words haunted him. Because the blade wasn't coming from across the border, it was being sharpened at his own table. At first, it was easier to pretend it was coincidence. A misstep here, a delayed convoy there, intelligence arriving a little too late. That's how betrayal always begins, masked as miscommunication, camouflaged in bureaucracy, hidden beneath layers of routine. But President Ibrahim Traoré was no stranger to chaos. He knew the battlefield, and he knew that when too many things go wrong at once, it's never by accident. It was the patterns that gave it away. Patterns only a soldier could see, patterns of precision, too clean, too sharp, too rehearsed. Enemies moving ahead of Burkinabe troops with surgical timing, striking ambushes at locations that were never publicly mentioned. It was as if someone had handed them a script, and they were reading every scene before it played out. Some of the highest-level operations had been crafted in airtight silence, known only to a handful of people. Yet, somehow, enemies were already there, waiting. Conversations that took place behind closed doors ended up dictating the movements of foreign-backed militias. Briefings that were guarded with encryption still bled into hostile hands. It wasn't one leak. It was a steady drip, constant and corrosive. Someone wasn't just watching. They were guiding the enemy's hand from within. The circle of suspicion was small, which made it even more dangerous. These were men Ibrahim had known for years, men who had stood with him through the revolution, shared meals during wartime, embraced his family as their own. How do you look at someone you've trusted with your life and see, behind the smile, the shadow of a dagger? That was the nightmare Ibrahim found himself walking through. Every joke at a briefing, every nod across the room, every handshake, now suspect. It was the kind of slow psychological warfare that eats through steel like rust. You begin to second-guess not just others, but yourself. Who do you trust when trust is the weapon? And the most terrifying part, the enemy wasn't using soldiers or guns. They were using information. A war fought not with bullets, but with knowledge. With names, dates, routes, supply lists. The kind of power that doesn't shout but whispers. The kind of power that turns allies into targets without ever firing a shot. That's how empires fall, not always through invasion, but through infiltration. And deep in his gut, Ibrahim knew it. Someone in his house was opening the doors from the inside. The enemy didn't need to storm the palace. They were already seated at the table, wearing uniforms, saluting the flag, speaking in the language of loyalty. But loyalty was dead, or at least it was being auctioned off to the highest bidder, the biggest promise, the safest exit plan. And if this went on any longer, it wouldn't just be his government that collapsed. It would be the country itself. Burkina Faso wouldn't fall in flames. It would crumble in silence, and no one would even know who lit the fuse. It was supposed to be routine, just another rotation up north, another quiet night listening to empty frequencies. Captain Issa Zongo had been assigned to monitor radio traffic from a remote outpost near the border, standard surveillance work, the kind that made most officers numb with boredom, static agricultural reports, weather bulletins, and the occasional coded message between field units. Nothing unusual. Until one night, the noise changed. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but to trained ears like Zongo's, something felt off. A pattern emerged in the background hum, like a second voice hiding behind the first. He leaned in closer, adjusted the filters, and played the transmission again. What sounded like a farm report about millet yields and livestock movement suddenly morphed into something far more sinister. Coordinates, grid references, timetables, military terms embedded in the language of soil and harvest, hidden in plain sight. Zongo's blood ran cold. He recorded it, decoded it line by line, and cross-referenced the data with the week's classified operations. His worst fear confirmed itself within hours. This wasn't background noise. It was a delivery system, and someone had embedded highly sensitive military intelligence within these public broadcast packets, using frequencies no one ever paid attention to. This wasn't amateur work. It was professional, calculated, and deliberately placed where only someone like Zongo, meticulous, detail-obsessed, and too stubborn to tune out the static, could have noticed. It was genius, in the most terrifying way possible. But what shook him more than the method was the content. The information being leaked wasn't old, it was fresh, too fresh. Movement logs from that very morning. Orders that had been given only the night before. This wasn't historical data or a recycled breach, it was live, active, ongoing. Whoever was feeding this to the outside world wasn't operating through old files or recovered hard drives. They were still inside, still listening, still connected to the very heart of the government's defense architecture. The enemy was receiving instructions in real time, and unless someone stopped it, lives would continue to be lost in the name of whispers. Zongo didn't wait. He didn't consult protocol. There was no time. He knew that if he sent this through regular channels, the traitor, whoever they were, might intercept it before it ever reached the president. So he drove, through the night. No sleep, no backup. Just a flash drive, a sidearm, and the kind of weight that buries a man's soul if carried too long. When he arrived at the palace gates just after dawn, covered in dust and sweat, the guards barely recognized him. He didn't care. He demanded to see the president directly, no intermediaries. What he held in his hand wasn't just evidence. It was a key, a crack in the mirror of loyalty, and it would change everything. Because with that one transmission, all doubt vanished. There was no longer a question of whether betrayal had occurred. It was no longer a suspicion, a theory, or a paranoid fear. It was fact. And it meant only one thing. Someone inside the highest levels of power had decided that Burkina Faso's future was worth trading for a promise, a payout, or protection from some foreign godfather in a clean suit and polished shoes. Zongo's discovery didn't just expose a leak. It opened a door to a war that had already begun, silent, invisible, and far more dangerous than anything that had come before it. The clock struck midnight, but sleep was not welcome in the palace that night, not when the weight of a nation's survival hung on silence, tension, and the bitter taste of betrayal. Ibrahim Traoré called for an emergency meeting, a gathering not of officials, but of brothers in arms, men who had fought beside him in trenches, who had bled on the same red soil, who knew the cost of peace and the price of revolution. These weren't politicians. These were warriors, each one hand-picked, not because of their rank, but because of their loyalty, the kind of loyalty that isn't written in ink but sealed in blood. No aides, no advisors, no electronics, just flesh, steel, and trust. The room, deep in the fortified wing of the Defense Ministry, was dim and heavy, like the calm before a thunderstorm. The only sound was the steady breath of men who knew something was very wrong. Zongo was the last to arrive, still wearing the dust from his journey. He stepped in and walked straight to the head of the table, not with arrogance, but with purpose. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to reveal. He opened his bag and laid down the printed transcripts, the decoded messages, the drive that held the audio files. For a long moment, no one moved. Ibrahim nodded once. Zongo pressed play, and the voice of betrayal filled the room. Not loud, not panicked, just clear, cold, clinical, the kind of voice you'd expect from someone who believed they were untouchable. The words were coded, yes, but not enough to hide their meaning. Positions of elite troops, extraction zones, meeting points, even contingency plans for a presidential evacuation. Someone had mapped out the heart of the Burkinabe resistance and handed it over to the enemy on a silver platter. The men around the table listened, their jaws set, their eyes narrowing as the layers of the deception unraveled. Each line of code wasn't just information, it was a dagger in the back of every soldier who had died, believing the fight was theirs to win. Then came the final blow. Zongo pulled a final document from his jacket, one that had come encrypted in a secondary packet buried within the message. It was a digital clearance record, tracking the source of the leak to a specific user access point, a terminal used exclusively by a single officer. A name stared back at them from the page, Colonel Daouda Kane, and the room went still. No one spoke because they all knew him, not as a name or a title, but as a man. Kane wasn't just a colleague, he was family, a war hero, a man who had once dragged Ibrahim from a burning armored vehicle with bullets flying over their heads, a man who had celebrated the nation's independence beside them, who had held their children, wept over fallen brothers, and stood unwavering during the darkest days of the insurgency. And now that man was the source of the nation's slow bleeding, the traitor behind the curtain. The air turned cold. Some of the officers shifted, others clenched their fists, but no one reached for a weapon. Ibrahim's voice broke the silence, not loud, but sharp. No one moves, no one confronts him, not yet. Some looked at him, confused. We don't strike the snake when it slithers past our feet. We wait, we follow it, and we find the nest. The strategy was simple in design but dangerous in execution. If Kane had already sold state secrets, there was no telling how far the rot had spread. Arresting him now would only burn the surface, cutting the infection without removing its root. They needed to watch, to shadow every step, track every call, follow every handshake. They would treat him like a comrade by day and hunt him like a ghost by night. It was the only way to know how deep the betrayal went and who else might be hiding behind the same mask of patriotism. That night, as the meeting ended and the men dispersed into the darkness, there was no sleep, no laughter, no relief, only purpose. Because from that moment on, every interaction with Colonel Kane would be a test, a performance, a game of masks, and behind each smile, each salute, each nod in the hallway, there would be eyes watching, listening, waiting for him to slip. And when he did, Ibrahim would be ready. Colonel Daouda Kane walked through the halls of power as if nothing had changed. His steps were calm, his voice steady, his smile as effortless as always. If he noticed anything different, the slight delay in greetings, the quick glances between guards, the tightened responses from officers, he gave no sign of it. That was the danger of a man like Kane. He didn't look like a traitor. He looked like home, like loyalty wrapped in medals, like history written in service, and that made him the most dangerous man in Burkina Faso. For the men tasked with watching him, every moment was a performance, a test of nerve. Zongo's team moved in silence, their presence invisible but constant. They tapped his communications, cloned his access cards, tracked his vehicle without his knowledge. Every route he took, every contact he met, every word he spoke was logged, analyzed, dissected. At first, it was routine. Kane went from the Ministry of Defense to the Intelligence Bureau, attended council meetings, sat in briefings. Nothing out of place. But then patterns began to emerge. Late-night departures without a detail, disappearing acts for hours at a time, a single black vehicle, unregistered to any agency, used exclusively by him after midnight. It never went through palace security. It never left a trail. It just moved, like a ghost, into the dark. The same route, the same hour, every other night. Zongo marked it, and the trail led them to a quiet residential block near the French diplomatic sector. A pale, aging house with shuttered windows, a rusted gate, and the eerie charm of something left behind on purpose. On paper, the house didn't exist. No tax records, no occupants. But the signs were all there: an external power generator, encrypted wireless signals pulsing irregularly, the faint scent of foreign cologne in the air. It was a safe house. And Kane wasn't just visiting, he was using it. They planted a micro-camera across the street, buried inside a weathered power junction. The first few nights were still, no movement. But then came the night everything changed. Just past 1 in the morning, Kane's car pulled in. He stepped out, checked his surroundings with the eye of a seasoned soldier, and entered. Minutes later, 2 men arrived, suits, clean-shaven, their posture not quite civilian. One carried a metallic suitcase. The other had nothing but a folder, thick and sealed. They greeted Kane not like an asset, but like a partner. The footage recorded every detail, the nods, the exchange, the folder changing hands, Kane giving them something in return. It was subtle, almost mundane, but Ibrahim didn't need volume or theatrics. What mattered was what the folder contained. The next morning, the team raided the abandoned house in secret, long after the visitors had vanished. Hidden behind a loose tile in the wall, they found the discarded cover sheet of the folder. It bore a presidential seal. The contents had detailed Ibrahim's travel plans for the next 4 weeks, locations, times, escort details. Everything a foreign actor would need to engineer an ambush, an assassination, or worse. It wasn't just betrayal. It was an invitation to strike at the very heart of the nation. Back in the palace, Ibrahim watched the footage in the dark. His face didn't twitch. He didn't blink. His jaw tightened only slightly, and his hands remained folded. But inside, a war began. Not against Kane, not even against the foreign suits, but against the system that had allowed this to fester in silence. Against the false sense of security that loyalty could be measured by medals or years of service. That night, he didn't rage. He planned. He picked up the secure line and called Zongo with a single sentence: "It's time." Because now there was no more doubt, no more waiting. The nest had been found, and the lion was ready to strike. The invitation came like any other, neatly typed, delivered by a junior aide, stamped with the seal of the Ministry of Defense. A strategic review meeting scheduled for 8 a.m. on the top floor of the defense tower. Colonel Daouda Kane accepted without hesitation. He had no reason to suspect anything. After all, he had spent the last year mastering the art of deception. If Ibrahim Traoré suspected him, he certainly wasn't showing it. In fact, the president had greeted him just days earlier with the same measured respect he always had, even joking briefly about a recent cabinet dispute. Kane had laughed along, confident, untouched. That was his mistake. On the morning of the meeting, Kane arrived in full uniform, pressed, polished, dignified. His medals caught the sunlight as he stepped into the marble lobby of the ministry. He saluted the guards, shook the hand of the building director, and took the elevator with his usual poise. But as the doors opened onto the top floor, everything changed. There were no aides waiting, no bustling activity, no other commanders, just silence. A corridor emptied by design. 10 elite soldiers in full tactical gear lined the hallway, motionless, eyes forward. In the center of the conference room stood President Ibrahim Traoré. Kane froze for just a fraction of a second, enough for the trained eye to catch. He glanced at the soldiers, then back at the president. Something in his body went stiff, like a man calculating his odds in real time. But there were none. No exit, no plea, no escape. Ibrahim didn't motion for him to sit. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stepped forward, eyes locked onto the man who had once fought by his side in battles that now felt like another lifetime. "You were my brother," Ibrahim said. The words didn't echo, but they landed with weight, with grief, with fury buried deep beneath restraint. "We trusted you with everything, the lives of our soldiers, the safety of our people, and you sold that for what? A suitcase? A promise whispered in a foreign accent?" Kane opened his mouth, but nothing came out. No denial, no defense, only silence. His throat tightened. Ibrahim stepped closer, just inches away. "Do you think they'll protect you now? Do you think they care what happens to you if I fall?" Behind them, Zongo entered with a black suitcase. He placed it on the table and opened it without a word. Inside were neatly packed stacks of foreign currency, miniature tracking devices, and a USB drive that held every shred of evidence, every intercepted call, every transferred file, every movement he had made. Proof so absolute it didn't require a confession. "You're not going to prison," Ibrahim said, his tone turning ice cold. "You're going to talk." And with that, the storm began. Kane was escorted from the room without resistance. He walked between the soldiers, not as a colonel, not as a war hero, but as a man who had just seen the inside of his own grave. They didn't blindfold him. They didn't bind his hands. They didn't need to. His world had already collapsed. He was taken to a black site buried beneath the Capitol. No windows, no clocks, no hint of day or night. A place built for silence, for truth. The room where he was held had no furniture beyond a single steel chair and a bolted-down table. The walls pressed in slowly with every hour. He was left alone, not to be tortured, but to think. To sit in the space between pride and fear, between loyalty and betrayal. The longer the silence stretched, the more it broke him. By the time Zongo returned, Kane's face was pale, his hands trembling. The man who had once carried the confidence of generals now looked like a shadow of himself, haunted by his own reflection, cornered by the choices he could no longer justify. Zongo didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He placed the USB on the table, tapped it once, and said only this: "They already know you've been caught. And they've already erased your name." Kane didn't respond. "You are disposable to them," Zongo continued. "But to us, you're still useful, if you start talking." The clock didn't tick, but the weight of time was suffocating. Kane looked down at the table, his voice cracking as it finally pushed past his pride. "They came to me last year," he whispered. "Said they needed a friend inside. Said I'd be doing it for stability, for peace." Then the promises started. A house in Paris, a seat on the UN Security Council. They said after Ibrahim falls, they'd restore order, make me a figurehead. Said it would be good for everyone. He swallowed, guilt flooding his voice. "I believed them. I let myself believe they actually cared about this country, but they don't. They never did. They only want the gold, the control, the silence. Zongo listened but said nothing. The words were no longer for him. They were for Kane's own soul, bleeding out in shame. And somewhere above ground, Ibrahim sat quietly in his office, listening through the feed. His heart didn't leap. His mind didn't celebrate. Because this wasn't victory. This was only the next step. The wound had been exposed. But the infection, the foreign hands pulling strings from afar, was still out there. And now that he had a map to follow, he was ready to burn the entire web down, one lie at a time. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Colonel Daouda Kane, the man who once walked with steel in his spine and fire in his eyes, now sat hollowed out, the shell of someone who had seen his legacy unravel before his very eyes. Days passed in that windowless room beneath the city, where silence acted as a scalpel, peeling back the layers of ego, stripping him of the illusions he once wore like armor. He stopped asking for lawyers, he stopped demanding explanations, and eventually he stopped pretending he wasn't afraid. The darkness spoke to him in a language louder than interrogation ever could. Every echo of his breath reminded him of the truth he had ignored. He had gambled the soul of his country on the empty promises of men who never cared if he lived or died. When Captain Zongo returned, he didn't bring files or threats. He brought a chair and sat across from Kane. No bulletproof vest, no restraints, just two soldiers face to face. Zongo watched him for a moment before speaking. "They still think you're working for them," he said flatly. "They've sent a message. They want an update. That means we still have time to turn this around. But if we wait too long, they'll realize you've gone dark. And then you're not just worthless to them, you're a liability, and we both know how they handle liabilities." Kane lifted his eyes, the shadows under them like bruises. "They promised me peace," he muttered, almost to himself. "Said Ibrahim was in the way, that the country needed order, investment, stability. They made it sound noble. I wanted to believe it." He paused, then added, "But they don't want peace. They want the gold, the land, the silence, everything we fought for. They want it back." Zongo nodded. "And now you have a chance to fight again, not with bullets, with truth." It took another 2 days for Kane to fully open up, but once he started, the dam broke. He gave names, aliases used by foreign handlers, their code phrases, communication routes. He detailed how they masked their payments through phantom companies and shell contracts, disguised as development projects. He revealed how they accessed satellite data, how they recruited local informants, how they used diplomatic pouches to move tech undetected. The scope of the operation was staggering. Burkina Faso hadn't just been infiltrated, it had been colonized in silence. A slow-moving conquest hidden under handshakes and press statements. Kane's betrayal had opened the gates, but the invaders had been planning this for far longer. They knew which ministers had financial weaknesses, which commanders had personal grudges, and which journalists could be bought or silenced. It was chess played in whispers, and the country had been caught 2 moves behind. Ibrahim listened to every report from the underground room. He didn't interrupt. He didn't issue commands. He absorbed. Because knowledge was power, and now he had it. The plan that unfolded before him wasn't just about removing him from office. It was about erasing everything his leadership represented: national ownership of resources, military independence, a free and proud population. The dream of sovereignty was dangerous to those who profited from submission, and so they moved carefully, first with bribes, then with misinformation, and finally with knives sharpened in the dark. But what they hadn't counted on was the lion waking up. What they hadn't planned for was Kane turning back. Because despite everything, despite his betrayal, the roots of loyalty still lived somewhere in him, buried under ambition perhaps, but not destroyed. And now, Ibrahim had a weapon far more valuable than revenge. He had Kane's knowledge. He had access to the hidden channels, the back doors, the masks his enemies wore. He had a voice they still trusted, And so the president made a decision that would alter the course of the silent war. Kane would not be executed, he would not be paraded or imprisoned. He would return to the field, but not as a soldier, as bait, as a weapon. As the shadow, they would follow back to the enemy's heart. It was a dangerous play, one that could backfire in a dozen ways. But it was the only path forward, because Ibrahim knew now that this was no longer a political struggle. This was survival. And to protect the future of Burkina Faso, he had to go deeper into the darkness than any of them had ever dared. This was a war fought with lies, and now, for the first time, they had one of their own to feed the enemy back their poison. The trap was set, and the hunters were about to become the hunted. Operation Phantom Flame was unlike any mission Burkina Faso had ever executed. It didn't involve tanks or helicopters or troops storming gates. It required something more dangerous, complete control of perception. A war fought in shadows, not with guns but with silence, smoke and misdirection. And at the heart of it all was Colonel Daouda Kane, now a ghost reborn. The very man who had once leaked the nation's lifeblood to foreign agents would now become the channel through which the enemies would choke on their own lies. He didn't return to the field with fanfare. His name remained scrubbed from official records. To the world, he had vanished. But behind the scenes, he was now the wire connecting Ibrahim's trap to every corner of the conspiracy. His first assignment came through encrypted chat, familiar codes, the same handlers. They hadn't noticed anything different. Kane crafted a carefully worded update. The president was showing signs of fatigue, there was tension in the ranks, and internal opposition was growing. It was exactly the kind of report his handlers wanted to hear. They responded with urgency, requesting specifics, offering to escalate support if he could push the right pressure points. Kane played the part flawlessly. He fed them troop movements, ones that were fake. He described fictional friction within the military, planted by Ibrahim himself. He even gave them a new meeting point for arms deliveries, an abandoned fuel depot now rigged with surveillance and counterintelligence teams. While the foreign agents grew confident, believing their asset was still in control, Zongo's task force quietly documented every interaction. They traced satellite calls, intercepted message relays, and mapped the full extent of the network. The revelations were staggering. The web stretched beyond Burkina Faso's borders, contacts in Côte d'Ivoire, encrypted briefings from Dakar, briefcase couriers moving through Niger, and most concerning of all, diplomatic channels being used to funnel classified information back to Europe under the cover of agricultural development missions. These weren't rogue actors. These were coordinated intelligence cells, operating under the protective veil of international partnerships and NGOs. Ibrahim had long suspected as much, but now he had proof, and proof was the one thing they couldn't deny. As the days passed, Operation Phantom Flame evolved into a dance. Kane would send intel, they would respond with instructions, and Burkina Faso would watch, record, and strike, not with bullets, but with exposure. One by one, foreign diplomats involved in the plot began to disappear from public view. A trade attaché was recalled unexpectedly. A senior advisor from a European humanitarian agency was detained at the airport for passport irregularities and quietly deported. A logistics expert from a foreign embassy simply vanished. No press releases, no outrage, just silence, deliberate and surgical. Each removal sent shockwaves through the network. Those still on the ground grew nervous, but they didn't yet understand the trap was tightening around them. Meanwhile, Ibrahim maintained his public composure. He held meetings, gave speeches, met with regional leaders. The world saw a calm, collected president holding his country together. But inside, he was orchestrating a symphony of misinformation. Military documents were forged to show troop deployments that didn't exist. Maps were altered, reports falsified, command chains twisted just enough to look authentic. And every fabricated piece of intelligence Kane passed along was loaded with a fuse. Every lie became a breadcrumb that led the enemy deeper into the labyrinth. And the deeper they went, the harder it would be to escape. The brilliance of the operation lay not just in its precision, but in its patience. There were moments when it would have been easy to make a public spectacle, to expose the plot with a grand announcement, to score political points with headlines. But Ibrahim didn't want applause. He wanted the entire machine dismantled from the inside, quietly, permanently. And so, with every passing day, the foreign agents believed they were closer to success. They believed their plan to destabilize the leadership was unfolding exactly as intended. They believed the next move would be theirs. What they didn't know was that their every word, every encrypted message, every whispered command was being used to seal their own downfall. Burkina Faso was no longer the chessboard. It had become the trap, and at the center of that trap was a president who had refused to flinch, even in the face of betrayal. He had turned the very tool of his enemies, their ability to manipulate and misinform, into a weapon of resistance. And now, as their agents grew bold, preparing for their final strike, they failed to see that the hunter they had stalked was no longer running. He was waiting. The message came just after dusk. Encrypted, urgent, simple in appearance, but heavy in implication. It was from a man who went by the codename Reed, a foreign operative whose true identity remained cloaked in diplomatic credentials and layers of forged affiliations. He claimed to be a regional advisor in agricultural development, a cover as old as espionage itself. On paper, he was harmless. In reality, he was one of the central architects of the silent campaign to topple Ibrahim Traoré. The message was clear. The window is closing. The president must fall before the elections. We are ready for phase 2. It was the moment Ibrahim and Zongo had been waiting for. Confirmation, not just of intent, but of timing. The final play was in motion. Colonel Kane responded precisely as they needed him to. He played the role of the loyal asset, concerned but compliant. He said security was tightening. The president was becoming suspicious. They had to act soon. Reed replied with coordinates for a meeting, a safe house just outside Ouagadougou, nestled in the outskirts behind an abandoned textile mill, surrounded by overgrown brush and long-forgotten warehouses. Midnight, discreet entry, no additional personnel. We'll bring the tools, you bring the clearance. The implication was unmistakable. This wasn't just a meeting. This was planning for assassination. Ibrahim gathered his team in the war room beneath the Ministry of Defense. The map of the city lit the wall like a heartbeat, flickering with movement markers, radio pings, and digital eyes on every approach. Zongo led the briefing, outlining the entry points, the extraction paths, the containment teams. But the air was tense, not from fear, but from restraint. No one in that room wanted a firefight. They wanted this done cleanly, surgically. They wanted the world to see without question who had been pulling the strings. No alarms, no gunshots. Just truth, finally dragged into the light. As midnight approached, Kane was prepped. His mic was sewn into the collar of his shirt, nearly invisible, sensitive enough to capture even the faintest whisper. A micro-tracker was laced into his belt loop. He was calm, but not composed. The weight of the moment pressed against him. This was the point of no return. If he hesitated, they would kill him. If he faltered, they might still escape. He looked Zongo in the eyes before leaving and said nothing. He didn't need to. They both knew what was at stake. He arrived at the safe house right on time. The building was dimly lit, a single bulb swaying in the wind above the steel door. Inside, 2 men were already waiting. Reed and a second operative with a French accent and a face Kane didn't recognize. They stood over a table scattered with satellite images, forged identity documents, and what appeared to be a portable jamming device. This was no longer speculation. This was an operational command center, a nerve point for foreign intervention disguised as diplomatic strategy. "You've been quiet," Reed said, not bothering with pleasantries. His voice was dry, his tone sharp. "Is the president suspicious?" Kane shook his head slowly, keeping his breathing steady. He trusts me, but I don't know for how much longer." Reed nodded. "That's fine. We don't need long. We're ready to move. We'll coordinate from Dakar. You just need to secure the president's location after the next military council. We'll handle the rest." Kane opened a black folder and laid down false clearance codes, forged by Ibrahim's cyber division. "These are the new access credentials for the council perimeter. They change in 72 hours. The second operative leaned forward, studying the pages. He looked up with a smirk. "You really did it. This is the final piece." Then Reed said it, the final proof, the words that would shatter any pretense of diplomacy. "No more waiting. The elections are too close. We take him out this week. It ends now." Outside, Zongo heard every word through the headset. He looked toward Ibrahim, who stood behind a soundproof glass wall, arms crossed, his expression carved from stone. There was no debate, no hesitation. He gave the order with a single nod. In seconds, the operation team moved. Unmarked vehicles surrounded the safe house. Silenced weapons were raised, but never fired. The door was breached with such precision that the operatives inside barely had time to reach for their concealed pistols before they were disarmed, bound, and forced to the ground. "You're under arrest," Zongo said firmly as he stepped into the room. Reed turned, defiant. "You have no right. We're diplomats." Zongo didn't blink. "Not tonight, you're not. Tonight, you're just exposed." The silence that followed was thicker than rage. As the operatives were dragged out into the night, stripped of their illusions, Kane slumped into a chair. He had done what few men in his position would have dared. He had turned back from the edge and delivered his enemy into the hands of justice. Ibrahim walked into the room moments later. He didn't speak to Reed. He didn't speak to the second man. He looked at them both, not with hatred, but with clarity. They had tried to crush a nation with deceit. They had tried to erase a leader with shadows, and now they stood defeated, not by bullets, but by truth. One of them, snarling, hissed, "You think you've won?" Ibrahim met his gaze and replied without blinking, "I didn't win. My people did." And outside, as dawn began to creep over the rooftops of Ouagadougou, the first whispers of a new truth began to echo across the city. The hunters had been hunted, and the lion had not only survived, he had shown his teeth. The sun rose slowly over Ouagadougou that morning, but it wasn't just another dawn. It felt different, warmer, louder, not because of noise, but because of energy. The kind of energy that comes when a storm passes and the air feels clean. Radios buzzed in market stalls with a single repeated headline, "Foreign operatives arrested in a failed plot to destabilize the Burkinabe government." People paused mid-conversation. Shopkeepers stopped counting their change. Taxi drivers leaned closer to hear. Crowds gathered around televisions in cafes and murmured around transistor radios in the villages. Even those who had doubted the rumors, the whispers of betrayal and espionage, could now feel it in their bones. The story was true, and the man who had stopped it wasn't a general hiding behind battalions or a politician playing safe with words. It was their president, the same young soldier who had once led a revolution, who had stood tall while others knelt, who had walked through flames when retreat would have been easier. Ibrahim Traoré. He hadn't just survived the coup attempt. He had dismantled it, brick by brick, quietly and strategically, without tanks rolling through the streets, without mass arrests or televised threats. He had fought them with intelligence, patience, and truth. And in doing so, he had proven something greater, that Burkina Faso was no longer a place where power could be bought with gold and silence. It was a place where betrayal would face consequences, where even foreign shadows would be dragged into the light if they dared to play with the country's sovereignty. Inside the Kosiam Palace, Ibrahim stood on the rooftop alone, watching the city slowly come alive beneath him. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He wasn't built for victory laps. For him, this wasn't a triumph. It was a warning answered, a test passed, a wound treated but not yet healed. He had seen the true face of the war they were in. It wasn't fought with armies. It was waged in secret rooms, in whispers, in the false promises slipped under the table by suits who never planned to honor them. It was fought by making the people believe they were powerless, but not anymore. Later that evening, Ibrahim stepped to the podium without a script, without bodyguards flanking him, just his military uniform, dust still clinging to his boots, and the calm of a man who had seen fire and chosen not to flinch. The country was listening. From the dimly lit corners of Sahel towns to the crowded rooftops of Bobo Dioulasso, every ear was tuned in. And when he spoke, his voice didn't rise in anger. It settled like stone. "I speak to you tonight not as a president," he began, "but as a brother, as a son of this soil, as a soldier sworn to defend it, not with words, but with my life." He paused. Let the silence breathe. There were those who thought we would not see this day, those who believed Burkina Faso would be too blind to notice, too divided to resist. They planned to take your voice, your land, your gold, again, just like they did before. But this time, they failed. He didn't raise his fist. He didn't shout. He looked straight into the lens, into the hearts of every man and woman watching, and gave them something far more powerful than anger: conviction. "I will never sell this country, not for gold, not for safety, not for power. Burkina Faso belongs to its people, and as long as I stand here, no one will take it from you again." The city erupted in applause. Cheers, whistles, chants echoed through alleyways and across hills. Even in remote villages where electricity flickered on and off, people clapped with tears in their eyes. They weren't just witnessing a speech, they were witnessing a promise, and for once, it didn't feel like just another politician trying to survive. It felt like a shield rising. Around the continent, young leaders took note. In Senegal, in Mali, in Chad, and even beyond Africa's shores, voices spoke Ibrahim's name not with curiosity, but with respect. In every place where sovereignty was being challenged, where nations were told to choose between obedience and survival, there was now a new example, not of defiance for the sake of defiance, but of a different kind of leadership, one that refused to kneel, one that chose to fight in silence until the moment the enemy finally exposed itself. And as night fell once again on the capital, Ibrahim didn't go to the banquet halls. He didn't celebrate with ministers. He sat outside beneath the stars with Zongo, the man who had once intercepted a strange farming signal and unknowingly cracked open the biggest betrayal of their time. They sat in silence for a while until Ibrahim finally spoke. "You did well," he said. Zongo nodded, humble as always. "I followed your lead." But Ibrahim wasn't smiling. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. After a long pause, he said what had already begun to stir in both their minds. "They'll try again, maybe with different names, different agents, different masks." Zongo didn't hesitate. "Then we stop them again." Ibrahim nodded, slow and firm. "As long as we stand together, they'll never take this land." And so the lion rested, but only for a moment, because men like Ibrahim Traoré do not sleep for long. They rise with their people, they fight in silence, and they protect the future with fire in their hearts.